There's nothing you can do to make God stop loving you, because God's love is not based on who you are, it's based on who He is. You are never wasting your time when you're waiting on God. In fact, it is the most important thing you do in life, because God did not put you on this planet to mark things off your to-do list.
She had sat in the same pew for more than 40 years. Same church, same songs, same people. Then one Sunday, everything felt different. The choir was gone. The pulpit had moved. The sermon sounded more like a motivational talk than a sermon. When she quietly asked what had happened, the answer was simple: we're trying to reach new people. That's when she realized something no one had actually said. The church she had helped build was no longer being built for people like her. But this wasn't happening in just one church. It was happening in thousands, and many believe it all traces back to one of the best-selling Christian books ever written. It began with a simple idea: every person has a purpose. When Rick Warren published The Purpose-Driven Life in 2002, few could have predicted what would happen next. It wasn't marketed as a blueprint for changing churches. It was written as a 40-day spiritual journey, inviting readers to ask one of life's oldest questions: why am I here? The response was extraordinary. Within months, millions of copies had been sold. Churches bought entire pallets. Businesses handed it to employees. Military chaplains distributed it to service members. It was translated into dozens of languages and reached readers on nearly every continent. Soon, it became one of the best-selling Christian books ever published. But the book was only the beginning. Behind it stood a pastor whose influence had been growing for decades. At Saddleback Church in Southern California, Rick Warren had built one of America's largest churches. Thousands attended each week. More importantly, pastors wanted to know how he had done it. Conferences filled with church leaders taking notes. Seminar rooms overflowed. Entire leadership teams traveled across the country, hoping to bring home whatever had made Saddleback so successful. Many believed they had found the answer. Churches across denominations began asking the same question: if this worked there, why wouldn't it work here? That question arrived at exactly the right time. Across America, many churches had been watching attendance slowly decline for years. Congregations were aging, young families were harder to reach, pastors worried that their churches were becoming invisible to the communities around them. Rick Warren didn't just offer encouragement, he offered a method. And for churches searching for hope, that difference mattered. But what many leaders didn't realize was that the book they were reading was connected to something much larger, a movement that had been quietly developing for decades, long before The Purpose-Driven Life ever appeared on bookstore shelves. The book made Rick Warren famous. The system made him influential. What many readers never saw was that The Purpose-Driven Life was only one part of a much larger vision. Behind the bestseller was a complete ministry model, one designed to help churches organize everything from preaching and small groups to leadership training and outreach. It wasn't created overnight. Years before the book became a global phenomenon, church leaders had been asking a difficult question: why were some churches growing while others were shrinking? That question gave rise to what became known as the church growth movement. Leaders like Donald McGavran argued that churches should remove unnecessary barriers that kept people from hearing the gospel. Later, thinkers such as C. Peter Wagner expanded those ideas, encouraging pastors to study their communities and reach people more intentionally. Then came pastors like Robert Schuller and Bill Hybels. They believed many people weren't rejecting Christianity, they were rejecting church as they experienced it. If churches felt unfamiliar or intimidating, why not remove those obstacles? Rick Warren took many of these ideas and turned them into a practical roadmap. Soon came the 40 Days of Purpose campaign. Boxes arrived at churches filled with sermon outlines, small group guides, promotional materials, videos, and leadership resources. Pastors didn't have to build a campaign from scratch. Everything was ready to use. For many churches, it felt like a breakthrough. Entire congregations studied the same material at the same time. Small groups multiplied, attendance climbed, volunteers became energized. Churches that had struggled for years suddenly felt alive again. It looked like more than a successful program. It looked like a formula. And once thousands of churches discovered a formula that seemed to work, they began applying it to far more than one 40-day campaign. The changes didn't begin with doctrine. They began with something far less noticeable. And that's why so many people didn't recognize them until years later. The first changes were easy to miss. No one stood up one Sunday and announced that the church was about to become something different. There was no dramatic vote, no public declaration. Instead, the transformation happened one decision at a time. The music shifted. Traditional hymns were sung less often. Contemporary worship songs became the norm. Choirs gave way to worship bands. Organs and pianos were joined or replaced by guitars, drums, and large screens displaying song lyrics. Then the language changed. The sanctuary became an auditorium. Visitors became guests. Sermons became messages. Fellowship halls became cafes. These changes were meant to make newcomers feel more comfortable, especially with little church background. The spaces changed too. Stages grew larger, lighting became more theatrical. Coffee bars appeared in lobbies, children's ministries expanded into colorful learning environments. Parking teams greeted arriving families. Every part of the Sunday experience was examined with one question in mind. Would this help someone come back next week? For many churches, the answer seems to be yes. New families arrived, attendance increased. Younger adults who had never attended church began walking through the doors. Many pastors saw these changes as practical tools for sharing an unchanging message in a changing culture. But not everyone experienced them the same way. Some longtime members looked around and quietly wondered what had happened to the place they loved. It wasn't that one change felt overwhelming. It was that dozens of small changes slowly created a church that no longer felt familiar. Supporters saw adaptation. Critics saw replacement. Neither side believed they were trying to harm the church. Both believed they were protecting something valuable. And that's what made the debate so difficult. Because it was never just about music, buildings, or terminology. It was about identity. As more churches embraced these changes, another pattern quietly emerged, one that couldn't be measured by attendance alone. At first, the numbers looked encouraging.
More people were visiting, parking lots filled earlier, new small groups formed, churches celebrated baptisms and growing attendance. From the outside, it looked like the strategy was working exactly as planned. But inside many congregations, another story was unfolding. It rarely made headlines. An older couple quietly stopped attending after decades of service. A volunteer who had taught Sunday school for years stepped away without explanation. A choir member found there was no longer a choir to join. These weren't dramatic departures, they were quiet ones. Across different churches and denominations, similar testimonies began to appear. Some longtime members said they no longer recognized the culture of their own church. They hadn't lost their faith, they simply no longer felt they belonged. Church leaders often responded with the same explanation: we're trying to reach the next generation. For many pastors, that wasn't an excuse, it was a genuine conviction. They believed difficult changes were necessary if churches were going to survive in a rapidly changing culture. That created an uncomfortable tension. Could a church reach new people without losing the trust of those who had built it? Some congregations found that balance. They blended traditional and contemporary worship. They kept long-held traditions while introducing new ideas. Others struggled to hold both together. Then another question emerged.
If churches were becoming more attractive to visitors, were they also helping people grow deeper in their faith? That question became impossible to ignore when one of the world's most influential seeker-sensitive churches looked at its own results. Leaders at Willow Creek Community Church conducted an extensive internal study known as the Reveal Project. Its findings suggested that while church programs were successful at attracting people, participation in those programs alone did not consistently produce mature disciples. The church publicly acknowledged the need to rethink parts of its approach. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer just about attendance, it was about transformation. If one of the pioneers of the movement was questioning its own assumptions, what would happen when the movement's most famous church faced its biggest test of all? For years, success seemed easy to measure. More people, more campuses, more services, more books sold. But the longer church leaders looked, the more complicated the picture became. Researchers studying American Christianity noticed that many of the challenges churches were facing were much bigger than any single ministry model. Younger generations were attending church less often. Cultural attitudes toward religion were changing. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that had already been developing for years, leaving congregations across the country trying to rebuild. That mattered because it challenged a common assumption. If attendance was falling almost everywhere, could one strategy solve a cultural shift that had been decades in the making? At the same time, another debate was growing inside evangelical churches. Some pastors began asking whether churches had become too focused on creating an excellent Sunday experience. Coffee bars, professional lighting, carefully planned services, branded sermon series. These features helped many visitors feel comfortable, but critics worried they also encouraged people to think like consumers, choosing churches based on preference rather than commitment. Researchers and ministry leaders sometimes described this pattern as spiritual consumerism. The concern wasn't that modern technology or contemporary music were inherently wrong. It was that people could become highly engaged with church activities without developing deeper relationships, stronger discipleship, or lasting community. Supporters pushed back. They argued that methods have always changed throughout church history. Printing presses, radio, television, and the internet were all considered new and controversial ones. To them, contemporary worship and modern ministry tools were simply another way of communicating an unchanging gospel. Both sides agreed on one thing: the mission mattered. They disagreed on the methods. Then, just as that debate reached its peak, the movement faced a challenge no conference or campaign could prepare for. Its founder stepped away. If the system was designed to outlast the man who built it, why did everything become more uncertain after he retired? For more than 4 decades, Rick Warren repeated the same principle: don't build a church around one personality. Build it around a purpose. It became one of the defining ideas behind the purpose-driven movement. A healthy church, Warren often taught, should be able to continue its mission long after its founding pastor is gone. Then came the moment that tested that idea. After leading Saddleback Church for over 40 years, Rick Warren retired. By then, Saddleback wasn't simply a large church. It had become one of the most influential training centers in modern evangelical Christianity. Thousands of pastors from around the world had attended its conferences. Church leaders had adopted its leadership principles. Its influence stretched far beyond Southern California. The transition was expected to demonstrate that the system could stand on its own. Instead, the years that followed became far more complicated. Like many large churches after the pandemic, Saddleback experienced attendance challenges and leadership adjustments. Staff changes drew attention. The church also entered a highly public disagreement with the Southern Baptist Convention after affirming women in pastoral leadership, a decision that led Saddleback's removal from the denomination. Supporters viewed the move as consistent with the church's convictions. Critics believed it departed from the denomination's interpretation of biblical leadership. At the same time, observers began asking another question: were these simply the normal struggles of any founder-led organization, Or did they reveal how difficult it is for any ministry, even one built around systems and structure, to transition beyond the influence of its founding leader? The answer wasn't obvious. Leadership succession is one of the greatest challenges faced by businesses, nonprofits, and churches alike. But the timing raised eyebrows, because the movement that taught churches not to depend on personalities suddenly found itself navigating life without the personality that had inspired millions. And that's when the story stopped being about Rick Warren alone and became a question every church eventually has to answer. Maybe the story was never really about one book, or one pastor, or even one church. Perhaps it was about a question that every generation of Christians eventually faces. How much can a church change before it begins to change what people believe the church is? There is little doubt that Rick Warren's influence reached around the world. Through the purpose-driven life, the purpose-driven movement, leadership training, and humanitarian efforts like the Peace Plan, millions of people were encouraged in their faith. Thousands of churches found practical tools that helped them organize ministries, welcome newcomers, and serve their communities more effectively. That part of the story deserves to be remembered. But so does the other part. Across America, many longtime members quietly walked away, not always because they rejected the gospel, but because they no longer recognized the communities that had once shaped their lives. At the same time, countless others discovered faith for the first time in churches that intentionally lowered barriers and spoke in language they understood.
Both stories are true, and that's what makes this conversation so difficult. The deeper question isn't whether churches should use new methods. Christians have adopted to new cultures, technologies, and languages throughout history. The real question is whether methods can slowly become the message if churches stop asking what should remain unchanged. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the purpose-driven movement isn't the book itself. It's the conversation it started. A conversation about growth and depth, mission and identity, innovation and tradition. Those questions didn't end when Rick Warren retired. If anything, they've become even more urgent as churches across America continue searching for their place in a rapidly changing culture. Because one day, every congregation will face the same decision, not whether to change, but what they refuse to lose when they do. And perhaps that's the question the next generation of church leaders will have to answer before they write the next chapter of American Christianity.